August 25th, 1942, 10:15 p.m., Milne Bay, at the southeastern tip of Papua New Guinea. Rain fell in solid sheets, hammering the jungle canopy until the whole coastline sounded like a drum. The narrow tracks behind the beach were no longer paths at all, but shallow rivers of mud churned by boots and swallowed again by water. In the darkness, there was no horizon, no clear line between sea and sky, only the occasional flicker of distant lightning that turned palm trunks into white bones for a split second, then erased them. Australian sentries stood under ponchos that did nothing. Their rifles were slick, metal sweating in the heat. The air pressed into lungs like wet cloth. Every breath felt heavy, warm, and half filled with salt. Somewhere in the black water offshore, engines began to murmur, low and steady, the sound of machines working in the night. They leaned forward to listen, trying to separate the noise of rain from the noise of war. Then shapes appeared. Not one, but many. Flat silhouettes sliding toward shore, cutting through the chop. Japanese landing barges moved with practiced spacing, their bows rising and dipping as they came in. No flares went up. No shells fell first. The invasion relied on silence, speed, and the belief that the defenders would break as others had broken all across the Pacific. A few minutes later, the first figures splashed into the shallows. Machine gun fire tore into the darkness from concealed positions along the beach. Tracer lines burned briefly through the rain. Men shouted in Japanese, then in English. The fight began so close that neither side had to search for the enemy. They could hear each other breathing, coughing, slipping in the water. For Japan, this landing was supposed to be routine, another amphibious strike in a war that had been a chain of victories since December. Their planners expected thin resistance, a handful of militia, badly trained and worse equipped, guarding incomplete airfields. Take the strip by dawn, bring in supplies, turn Milne Bay into a forward base. Simple. For Australia, the stakes were felt in a different way. Milne Bay was not the mainland, but it was close enough to make the threat real. If the airfields here fell, Japanese aircraft could reach deeper into the approaches to Australia, and the sea lanes that kept Port Moresby alive would be under heavier pressure. This was not a distant battlefield. It was the edge of the defensive line. What happened over the next 72 hours would decide whether the pattern of 1942 continued. Surprise, overwhelm, retreat. Across Malaya, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, the story had been the same. Japanese forces struck hard, moved fast, and left defeat behind them. The idea that they could not be stopped had become a weapon on its own. But Milne Bay was different. The defenders were not stumbling into a fight unprepared. They had been sick, soaked, and exhausted for weeks, building airstrips in swamp ground, living with fever and rot, learning the terrain the hard way. The misery had not made them softer. It had made them stubborn. In the rain, in the mud, in the absolute dark of a tropical coast, the Japanese came expecting an easy win. The Australians waited and chose not to give ground. August 1942. The Pacific War was not yet a year old, and Japan had not been stopped anywhere on land. Since December, the sequence had been relentless. Pearl Harbor had crippled the American Pacific Fleet. Hong Kong and Malaya had fallen in weeks. The Philippines were collapsing under siege. In February, Singapore surrendered. More than 80,000 Allied troops laying down their arms in what became Britain's worst military defeat. By March, Java was gone, sealing Japanese control of the Dutch East Indies. The rising sun now flew from Burma across the islands to the Solomons. In less than 8 months, Japan had built an empire stretching thousands of miles. It was larger than anything Germany controlled in Europe, and it had been taken at a speed that stunned Allied planners. Every defeat reinforced the same conclusion. Japanese forces were aggressive, disciplined, and unstoppable once they landed. Papua New Guinea sat directly in the path of that expansion. Its southern coast was the final barrier before Australia. Port Moresby, perched on the Coral Sea, was the key. If Japan took it, enemy aircraft and naval units would sit astride the approaches to Australia's northern cities and sever the sea routes linking Australia to the United States. The fall of Port Moresby would isolate Australia strategically, even if no invasion followed immediately. Japan's plan to take it was already underway. One arm moved overland along the Kokoda Track, forcing Australian troops back through the Owen Stanley Range in brutal jungle fighting. The second arm was maritime. Seize forward bases on the southeastern coast of Papua New Guinea, establish airfields, and dominate the Coral Sea from the west. Milne Bay was central to that design. The bay formed a long, narrow indentation at the far southeastern tip of the island. Its coastline stretched roughly 22 miles, hemmed in by jungle-covered mountains on one side and shallow coastal waters on the other. There was no depth to the position. One muddy coastal track linked everything: airfields, camps, supply dumps. Whoever controlled that track controlled movement inside the bay. By mid-1942, Allied engineers were racing to turn Milne Bay into an airbase. 3 strips were under construction, carved out of swamp ground by Australian units and American engineers working around the clock. They were incomplete, fragile, and barely serviceable. But they mattered. From Milne Bay, fighters could protect Port Moresby and challenge Japanese movement in the Coral Sea. For Japan, the logic was straightforward. Capture Milne Bay, finish the airfields, and use them to support the push on Port Moresby. The landing would also cut Allied shipping routes and force the Australians onto the defensive once again. For the Allies, the calculation was equally stark. If Milne Bay fell, there was no prepared position behind it. The loss would not be just tactical, but psychological. Another confirmation that every Japanese landing succeeded, and every Allied defence eventually collapsed. General Douglas MacArthur had only recently established his Southwest Pacific headquarters in Australia. His entire strategy depended on holding Papua New Guinea long enough to rebuild Allied strength. Milne Bay was not a major city, not a famous name, but in August 1942, it became critical ground. In this remote, rain-soaked strip of jungle, the war's direction in the Southwest Pacific was about to be tested. The defence of Milne Bay rested on men who were not expected to fight a decisive battle. At the top of the command chain stood Major General Cyril Claus. He was 57 years old, a veteran of the First World War, and had earned his reputation at Gallipoli and on the Western Front. He was not flamboyant, not politically connected, and not inclined to dramatic gestures. Those who served under him described him as methodical, stubborn, and calm to the point of irritation. He had taken command of Milne Force only weeks before the Japanese landing. Claus had been given a task few envied: defend more than 20 miles of exposed coastline with limited infrastructure, unreliable communications, and troops weakened by disease. Senior officers in Port Moresby doubted that the Japanese would even attempt a landing there. Claus disagreed. He ordered defensive positions dug, fields of fire cleared, and reserves identified, despite being told repeatedly that he was overestimating the threat. Where others saw paranoia, Claus saw risk. The backbone of his force was the 7th Australian Infantry Brigade. These men were not veterans of the current war. Most had enlisted in the militia expecting garrison duty or coastal defence at home. They came from Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and country towns, clerks, factory hands, labourers, farmers. Their average age was just over 20. Few had fired a weapon in anger before arriving in Papua New Guinea. For weeks before the battle, they had laboured in conditions that broke bodies faster than combat. Constant rain rotted uniforms and boots. Malaria, dysentery, and dengue fever swept through the camps. Men reported for duty, shaking with fever, skin yellowed, eyes sunken. Morale sagged, not from fear of battle, but from exhaustion and isolation. They were far from home, sick, and unsure why this swamp mattered at all. Alongside them were units of the 18th Brigade, newly arrived and not yet fully deployed, as well as more than 1,000 American engineers. The engineers were not infantry. They carried rifles, but their primary task was construction, airstrips, supply dumps, roads. They were essential to the mission, but they were not trained for jungle combat. Above the mud and rain, another small group played a decisive role. Number 75 Squadron of the Royal Australian Air Force operated from the half-finished airstrips at Milne Bay. Their Kitty Hawk fighters flew from surfaces that barely qualified as runways. One of their pilots was Flight Lieutenant Peter Turnbull, 24 years old, from Tasmania. Like most of his squadron, he had little combat experience, but he flew daily reconnaissance missions over the surrounding seas. On August 24th, Turnbull and his wingmen sighted Japanese naval forces moving toward Milne Bay, cruisers, destroyers, and troop transports. He radioed the warning that confirmed Clo's fears. The invasion was coming. What set these men apart was not elite training or superior equipment. It was position. They were fighting at the edge of Australia's defensive perimeter, with nowhere left to fall back. They had watched the newsreels of defeat. They understood what surrender and retreat had meant elsewhere. By the night of August 25th, they were wet, sick, and worn down. But they were ready. The Japanese operation against Milne Bay was planned as a limited, decisive strike. It carried the formal designation Operation RE, and it was built on confidence born of uninterrupted success. The assault force consisted primarily of the 5th Corps Naval Special Landing Force, roughly 1,200 men. These were not improvised troops. They were elite naval infantry, trained specifically for amphibious warfare, veterans of earlier campaigns in China and the Pacific. Their commander, Captain Kiyomi Yano, was regarded as aggressive and reliable, a man expected to finish the job quickly and move on. They were reinforced with an element that few Allied soldiers in the Pacific had yet encountered on land: Type 95 light tanks. The Japanese command believed tanks would provide decisive shock even in jungle terrain. Allied doctrine assumed armor was unusable in such conditions. The Japanese were about to test that assumption. Japanese intelligence assessments were badly flawed. Reports indicated that Milne Bay was defended by no more than 2 or 3 companies of Australian militia, perhaps 500 men in total. The airfields were believed incomplete and lightly guarded. The plan was simple: land at night, push inland before dawn, seize the strips within 24 hours, and present the Allies with a fait accompli. The reality on the Allied side was more complicated and in many ways more dangerous. Major General Klaus had nearly 8,500 men under his nominal command, but only a fraction were positioned to meet the landing directly. The 7th Brigade provided around 3,000 infantry. Elements of the 18th Brigade were still arriving and dispersing. American engineers and Air Force personnel made up a significant portion of the remaining strength, but they were not trained or organized for sustained ground combat. Numbers existed on paper, but combat power was uneven and scattered. The terrain magnified every weakness. Milne Bay offered no maneuver room. A single coastal track ran through swamp and jungle, linking the airfields and camps. Move off the track, and men disappeared into mangroves, kunai grass, and waist-deep water. Vehicles bogged instantly. Reinforcement and withdrawal followed the same narrow route. Whoever controlled the track controlled the battle. The appearance of Japanese tanks created an immediate crisis. Australian forward units had never faced armour before. Anti-tank guns were not positioned forward. Rifles and light machine guns were useless against steel hulls. Early reports of tanks were dismissed by higher headquarters as confusion or exaggeration. Tanks in jungle fighting were considered impractical, almost mythical. Yet they were there, advancing in the dark. Air power was the one potential advantage, but it was fragile. The Royal Australian Air Force had fewer than 24 operational fighters at Milne Bay. The airstrips were mud fields that swallowed wheels. Takeoffs were hazardous, landings worse. Maintenance was improvised, ammunition hand-carried through rain. Japanese aircraft dominated much of the surrounding region, and flying in constant storms pushed aircraft and pilots to the edge of survivability. Command and control added another layer of uncertainty. Field telephone lines were cut repeatedly by rain, movement, and shellfire. Radio communication was unreliable. Unit commanders often fought in isolation, with little understanding of the wider situation. Reports conflicted. Positions were misidentified. In the first hours, some units fired at shadows, unsure who was advancing and who was retreating. By the morning after the landing, pressure to withdraw was already building. One airstrip had been abandoned. Forward units had been pushed back miles. Supplies were being destroyed to prevent capture. From Port Moresby, evacuation was discussed as a contingency. The choice was brutal and immediate. Stand and fight unsupported infantry against armour, in mud, at night, with unreliable communication. Or withdraw, concede Milne Bay, and add another link to the chain of Allied defeats. On August 26, 1942, the Australians chose to stand. Night fell fully over Milne Bay as the first Japanese landing wave moved ashore. At 10:30 p.m. on August 25th, barges grounded near Ahioma on the eastern edge of the bay. There was no preparatory bombardment. The attackers relied on darkness and rain to mask their approach. Naval Special Landing Force troops splashed into the shallows, weapons held high, expecting scattered resistance and confusion. Instead, they met prepared fire. Australian machine gun positions opened up from concealed points along the beach. Tracer cut low across the water. Several Japanese fell before reaching dry ground. The 61st Battalion had been waiting for hours, soaked and silent, ordered not to fire until the enemy was fully committed. The first exchange was brief and violent. Surprise did not belong to the attackers. Numbers told quickly. Japanese troops pushed inland, establishing a beachhead and beginning their advance along the coastal track. Shortly before midnight, the sound changed. Engines growled closer, heavier and mechanical. Two Type 95 tanks rolled off the barges and onto solid ground. Forward Australian scouts reported armoured vehicles moving inland. Higher headquarters dismissed the reports. Shortly after 2 a.m. on August 26th, the tanks reached positions near KB Mission. They emerged out of the rain with headlights briefly flickering, machine guns raking the tree line. Rifle fire bounced uselessly off armour. Without anti-tank weapons, Australian units fell back in disorder. Panic spread along the line, but it did not become a rout. Sections withdrew towards secondary positions they had prepared earlier. KB Mission Airstrip was abandoned before dawn. The Japanese had achieved their immediate objective, but at a cost. Resistance had been heavier than expected, and progress slower. First light revealed a confused battlefield. Japanese forces held roughly 3 miles of the coastal track. Australian units were battered but intact. Rain continued without pause. Major General Clowes ordered reinforcements forward instead of retreat. The 210th Battalion moved up to stabilise the line. That morning, the air war began. Despite the mud, Royal Australian Air Force fighters lifted off from No. 1 Strip. Pilots attacked Japanese ships still unloading offshore, strafing barges and supply points. Japanese fighters intercepted, and dogfights broke out over the bay. Neither side gained full control of the air, but the Japanese supply effort was disrupted from the first day. By mid-afternoon on August 26th, Australian infantry counterattacked along the track toward KB Mission. Movement was slow and exhausting. At 3 p.m, contact was made. Small arms fire echoed in the jungle, then the tanks appeared again, pushing forward through mud and debris. This time, Australian anti-tank rifles had arrived. One tank was hit and disabled at close range. The effect was immediate. The machine was not invulnerable. Word spread quickly along the line. Fear gave way to calculation. That night, the Japanese launched a renewed assault aimed at breaking through to the remaining airstrips. Tanks led, infantry following closely. The attack focused on positions near No. 3 Strip. Fighting became close and chaotic, with grenades and bayonets used in darkness and rain. Around 3 a.m. on August 27th, Japanese troops reached the edge of the strip. Demolition charges were prepared. The situation was critical. At 4 a.m., Australian infantry counterattacked with bayonets fixed. Exhausted men charged into the dark, engaging at arm's length among grounded aircraft and supply dumps. The assault surprised the attackers. After 45 minutes of fighting, the Japanese fell back. By dawn, their advance had stalled. Over the next 2 days, air attacks intensified. Japanese reinforcements struggled to land under fire. Supply shortages grew. Attempts to bypass Australian positions through jungle failed as units became lost and isolated. On August 28th, the initiative shifted. Fresh Australian troops moved forward. The defenders stopped reacting and began advancing. The coastal track slowly returned to Allied control. By August 31st, Japanese commanders ordered evacuation. The easy victory never came. By early September, the battle had narrowed to its final shape. The surviving Japanese forces had been pushed eastward, compressed against the coastline near the small village of Goroni. After more than 10 days of continuous fighting, their strength was badly reduced, but they were not broken. Roughly 900 men remained under Captain Yano's command. They were dug in on slightly higher ground, with the sea at their backs and evacuation as their only remaining hope. Australian patrols confirmed what intelligence officers already suspected. Japanese destroyers were expected offshore within hours. If the defenders held until nightfall, the core of the invasion force would escape. Major General Close understood the implication immediately. Allowing evacuation would erase much of the victory already gained. The enemy had to be destroyed where it stood. Before dawn, on September 5th, Australian units assembled for the final assault. The same battalions that had fought since the first night, 2/9th, 2/10th, and the 61st, moved forward again. The men were visibly deteriorated. Many were running fevers. Their uniforms were torn and rotting. Boots were held together with wire and tape. Despite this, the advance went in on schedule. At 4:30 a.m., the attack began. As Australian infantry closed on Goroni, they were met with immediate and disciplined fire. Japanese positions were well prepared. Machine guns were concealed behind palm trunks and earthworks. Mortars dropped rounds into the swampy approaches. The first wave stalled almost at once. Men fell in the mud, unable to move forward or back. For 2 hours, repeated attempts gained nothing. Casualties mounted steadily. Junior officers were hit leading from the front. Stretcher bearers struggled to move wounded men through knee-deep water. The Japanese defense held firm, buying time with every minute. By mid-morning, the situation reached a breaking point. Intercepted signals confirmed that Japanese destroyers had departed their base and were on schedule to arrive that night. Klaus faced a narrowing set of options. Continued frontal assault risked heavy losses with no guarantee of success. Waiting risked letting the enemy escape. He chose the most dangerous alternative. Orders went out for Australian units to pull back several hundred yards. Almost immediately, Royal Australian Air Force fighters were called in to strike Goroni at extremely close range. There were no modern forward air controllers. Target marking was improvised. The margin for error was measured in seconds. At 8:45 a.m., Kitty Hawks appeared at treetop height. Machine guns and bombs tore through the Japanese perimeter. Huts collapsed. Palm trees splintered. The effect was devastating, not only physically, but psychologically. There was no depth to the position, nowhere to withdraw under air attack. The strike lasted minutes. As the aircraft pulled away, Australian infantry surged forward. This time, resistance collapsed unevenly. Some Japanese positions fought to the last. Others fell silent. The battle dissolved into close combat among burning huts and shattered defences. It was brutal and unstructured, driven by exhaustion and momentum rather than orders. By late morning, organised Japanese resistance ceased. Captain Yano ordered a retreat toward the beach, but discipline had fractured. Small groups fled into jungle or surf. Some attempted to swim out to sea. Many were cut down or drowned. By early afternoon on September 5th, Goroni was secured. That night, Japanese destroyers arrived offshore to evacuate survivors. They found silence, wreckage, and scattered men emerging from the jungle. After hours of waiting, they withdrew. The battle ended where it began, in darkness, rain, and exhaustion. This time, the Australians still stood. The fighting ended slowly, not with a single clear moment, but with exhaustion and silence. In the days after September 5th, Australian patrols moved cautiously through the jungle east of Goroni. They found scattered Japanese soldiers, wounded, starving, delirious from disease and exposure. Some fought to the death when discovered. A small number surrendered, something still rare in this phase of the war. Many more were found dead in the swamp or along the shoreline, victims of wounds, hunger, or failed attempts to escape by sea. The final casualty figures told a stark story. Australian forces lost more than 160 men killed and over 200 wounded during the battle. Disease would claim additional lives in the weeks that followed. Japanese losses were far heavier. At least 600 were confirmed dead, with estimates rising significantly when those lost in the jungle or drowned were included. Of the roughly 1,750 troops who landed at Milne Bay, only a fraction returned to their bases. Among the wreckage were 3 destroyed Type 95 tanks. They were the first Japanese armoured vehicles captured and studied by Allied intelligence in the Pacific. Documents recovered from abandoned positions revealed how completely the attackers had underestimated the defence. Milne Bay was meant to fall in a single day. Major General Close submitted his after-action report to higher command. It was brief and restrained. The enemy had been decisively defeated, he wrote, but his force was close to collapse from sickness and fatigue. Less than half of the troops under his command were fit for continued operations. Victory had been achieved, but at a severe physical cost. For the men who survived, the battle marked a dividing line. Pilots of the Royal Australian Air Force continued operating from the same muddy strips they had defended, now with greater confidence and experience. Infantry units rotated out slowly, many men evacuated with malaria, dysentery, or tropical ulcers that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Strategically, the impact of Milne Bay was immediate. For the first time in the war, a Japanese amphibious landing had been defeated outright by ground forces. The pattern of attack and retreat was broken. News of the victory spread quickly through Allied commands and civilian populations starved for positive reports. Morale rose sharply in Australia, where fear of invasion had been growing since early 1942. The lessons were studied carefully. Jungle fighting doctrine changed. Anti-tank tactics were revised. Air and ground coordination, improvised under extreme conditions at Milne Bay, became a reference point for later operations. Just as importantly, confidence shifted. Japanese infantry were no longer viewed as unbeatable. The wider war reflected that change. While Milne Bay was being fought, Australian troops were holding on along the Kokoda track. Supplies and reinforcements continued to flow because the bay remained in Allied hands. By November, Japanese forces were retreating there as well. Historians would later debate turning points. Midway had broken Japanese naval power. Milne Bay broke something different: the belief that Japanese land forces would always prevail once they attacked. Today, little remains of the battlefield. The jungle reclaimed the airstrips. A small memorial stands at Goroni, bearing the names of Australian dead. A separate monument honours Japanese losses. The ground itself is quiet, heavy with heat and vegetation. What happened there mattered far beyond the bay. In rain and mud, against expectation and precedent, Australian soldiers stood and held. Not because they were elite, and not because conditions favoured them, but because retreat was no longer acceptable. At Milne Bay, the war in the Pacific changed direction.